Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started again. We want to stay on time because we have so much to cover, and we want to make sure that our wonderful presenters have their full allotment of time. So welcome to plenary session number 3. We are excited to welcome Lissa Jones-Lofgren. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box. If you have any technical issues, please put that in the chat and our producer can help. I'm very pleased to welcome Lissa. She's principal and consultant at Lissa L. Jones, a boutique consulting firm leveraging education and research about the complexities that live at the intersection of race, culture, beliefs, and practice as a catalyst for movement toward greater equity. An organization behaviorist, Lissa's work takes many forms, including interim executive directorships, equity and culture coaching, training, and presenting. Areas of expertise include organization psychology, race and culture, equity and inclusion, interdisciplinary communications, and observation spirit. Lissa is also a member of the Hennepin County Racial Equity Advisory Council and a host of Black Market Reads, a podcast of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature. I had the privilege of hearing and seeing Lissa on a national, our executive directors group at the national level for NAMI, and I was so impressed with her presentation, her spirit, her just everything about her, that I said we need to have her be part of our annual conference. She's a resident of the Twin Cities, our neighbor to the north. Very, very happy to welcome, a warm Iowa welcome. And Lissa, by the way, we have over 200 participants right now. I'm sure we'll have more joining us from all across the country. Please join me in welcoming Lissa.
Oh, Peggy, bless you and thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm very, very grateful to be here, and it's wonderful to see you again, Peggy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Nina, thank you for everything you did to get me ready, and Zach for making sure that this is all working. Nina, should I try to share my screen?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm really honored to be here. That was a very generous welcome that Peggy gave me. I hope I can live up to it. I will do my very best. I work in radio, and so you may hear a bit of audio from time to time. Twice in this presentation, you shouldn't expect to see any audio. Any video. You should expect only to hear audio. So it's my privilege today to talk to you a little bit about this idea of race and culture. We need to learn a new language. We've never lived in a society where we have developed a common language to talk about issues of race and culture, or about the construction of the idea of race and its implications. And so we often talk past each other, and we have different experiences in America based on race and culture, and we have not yet developed a common language to talk about those different experiences either. So our hope for today is that we just begin the conversation about giving people a little bit more information about race and culture and their impacts and differences in order to help us all get better at developing a common language. So I invite you to join me in this experience, and we will leave time at the end for questions. Thanks so much.
The vast majority of white Americans have really never been in a position where we've had to think actively about race and racism. In fact, we sort of have the privilege historically and still today of being really oblivious to the lived experiences of people of color. So then when those experiences get brought to our attention, either because people of color talk about them, or some racial incident takes place, or some study comes out demonstrating, discrimination, we're usually caught very much off guard. We're sort of in that la-la land of believing that, we're sort of in this post-racial place. And unfortunately, it's been that way for a long time. It's not just a modern phenomenon. White folks going back 40, 50 years did not, even in the early 60s, think that racism was really a big deal worth focusing very much attention on. A very small minority realized that it was. But the vast majority of whites said at that time that people of color had equal opportunity with white folks. So I think it's difficult because to be white is to be in that sort of bubble of obliviousness where you don't have to think about it. And if you don't have to think about it, you don't get a lot of practice talking about it. And if you don't have a lot of practice talking about it, when you finally have to, you usually don't have the language, you don't have the skills. It's like having a book club where people of color and white folks have all been asked to read the same book. And in this case, it's the book of their collective life. People of color have read 400 pages, white folks have read the preface, and then we're supposed to come together and have a conversation. It's not easy.
That was the activist and writer Tim Wise. He was talking about the idea of trying to struggle to develop a common language, but we have such a different experience reading the same book based on this construction we have created called race. We define it as a grouping of human beings based on shared physical or social qualities into categories generally viewed as distinct by society. Race was constructed for the purpose of differentiation, differentiating who would have power and who would not. It was the easiest way to separate people who sometimes spoke a common language or who came from common cultures, but the skin colors were different, and it became a way of categorizing people. Isabel Wilkerson, the author formerly of The Warmth of Other Suns, who's now the author of Caste, talks about the idea that much like we see in other countries, in America, race inevitably puts people into caste positions. So race is a social construct that we have designed, developed, and we desperately protect in this country. If you were to look at Webster's Dictionary, Merriam-Webster's Dictionary online, the international version, words mean things. Definitions matter. When we are thinking about how we categorize things or how we see things in the world, we have to recognize that whatever the input is generally informs our output. In this case, if you are looking at a dictionary around the world and you look up the word white, well, it's sort of being a member of a group or race. Again, there comes up this social construct of race in the dictionary, which reinforces the idea that there is a reality to race, which is really not true, but free from spot or blemish, innocent, free from moral impurity, associated with good character, marked by upright fairness. I juxtapose this with the picture next door to say it would be difficult knowing that that is a part of our history and very much a part of our present, though we don't like to talk about it in that way, that it almost makes the other impossible. But that's the dictionary 2020. Oh, but not if you're Black. Then you're dirty, soiled, sinister, or evil. Indicative of condemnation or discredit, the opposite of white. That picture didn't happen. It did happen the other way around. And that reminds me that this probably is not true either. And notice the absence of the word race. Race is a verb. What I mean by that is that beliefs inform behaviors. If I believe that someone is worthy of my time and energy, I will give it to them. If I feel for whatever reason that they are not, then I might give it to them differently or not at all. The YWCA of Mankato, in their annual event, Let's Talk About Race, identified these realities. We struggle over the meanings of race and equality. We've never lived in a society that is equitable, so we struggle to describe it and define it. It's one reason why we keep trying to redefine equity and diversity and inclusion, trying to just get across some idea of something we've never seen. We struggle. We prefer to address the symptoms rather than the roots of social problems. We blame people's circumstance on them. We will see later in our slides that those myths are held dear And they were identified by Peggy Mcintosh when she came to St. Paul, Minnesota to talk about facing race. Mankato also found out over the course of many years in these time to talk discussions that we are generally more comfortable discussing class and gender. I don't know about you, but there's something I don't like about talking about money. And I think to myself, gosh, if I would rather talk about money, class, over race, that must be pretty serious. We often don't acknowledge the ways that race is fundamental to what happens and to people's experience here in the United States. We often don't recognize or acknowledge the legacies of what has happened in this country. Even today, when we are split and divided about rights, we can't really debate why are we divided. And that these myths that we have and we hold so dear, they hold deeply to them because we believe them, because we don't have any other information most of the time. New information about who people are isn't given in our school system, even in college. Given the difficulties of this country, our historical documents do not, most often taught in schools, represent exactly what happened to everybody in that historical time and context. Oftentimes history is written by the people who, I guess, end up with the pencils and the paper. And whatever I believe about someone, whether they have mental illness, whether they have some other kind of physical illness, can often inform the way I treat them. And then I think to myself, what did my mother say about women working outside of the house? How did my grandfather feel about immigration? And what did my aunt say about atheists? I don't know what kinds of beliefs your family transferred onto you, but I can tell you that in the human experience, culture is transferred unconsciously most of the time. Sometimes we're very overt and we say things, that we wouldn't want to say in other company. But these beliefs that we hold dear, sometimes we don't even know we hold them until we are faced with meeting somebody who fills that box, who checks that experience in us, and we realize somehow our body's just a little more tense, or we move a little bit further away, and we may not even recognize where that came from. But these beliefs serve purpose, power. If I can keep people in boxes where I like them, it is much easier for me to do what I'd like to do. But if the people come out of the box and they're not those things, or they're not only those things, well, then it's upsetting to my box. Then everyone's not acting right. And we'll see that myth come up too. Culture is different than race. I often suggest to people, if you wish to see culture, close your eyes. It keeps you from seeing race and from your mind going to that construct. Culture is about customs. It's about the way of being in the world, art and institutions, achievements of people, language, the way we relate to one another. In my family, we had, prior to the pandemic, we had Soul Food Sunday so that my parents could see everybody. And even when my mom passed, we kept up that tradition. And it's something we hold very close that I don't know has anything to do with our skin, but it has everything to do with our culture of loving one another and being able to look your children in the eye and see if they're all right, to get them off of their phones and their social media. Culture. It's hard to see culture because race is like a veil, an iron curtain that comes down before you can ever see culture, especially when we're relating to people who speak a similar language, who live in similar ways as we do in the United States. We might be able to see culture if that person were from France or from England or from somewhere else, that we might see culture over race, might. because our society is so highly raced, you really literally have to fight that. If you want to see culture, close your eyes. Cultural diversity is this idea that different and diverse cultures can get together, that we can do something in the world together without having everybody have to assimilate and do it one way. We don't all have to speak the same language. We don't all have to eat the same food. We don't all have to do the same thing. But the myth of monoculture is choking this country. And it's one of the myths that you will see that Peggy comes up with in her work. We don't all have to behave the same way in order to live together. In fact, I would argue it would be quite boring. Equity. It's the fair and respectful treatment of everybody. It's the presumption of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's amazing to me, as a 52-year-old woman, how much we've learned on the playground in kindergarten that we really need to retain in our adulthood, but somehow, I don't know, we leave the lessons behind. How do I want to be treated? If I'm a person who is deemed to have a mental illness and somebody knows about it, do I want them to treat me differently? Or would I like to be treated fairly and respectfully, regardless of diagnosis? Every human being, I think, ultimately just wants to be treated respectfully. I really do believe that. Even people who behave disrespectfully, I think something hurt them. Valuing diversity means that we respect that people are unique. One thing that I have learned over time in my management roles in my day-to-day life is that if you let people do them, let them blossom, let them go. Hey, I provide the structure, you provide the content, huh? So we can follow the rules so I can keep you safe. But other than that, create and ideate and celebrate. And why is it threatening to us? Why is it difficult? Inclusion means that everybody who's there feels respected, accepted, and valued, not tolerated. Respected and valued, whether I have a diagnosis or not. This is what culture looks like. Race is nowhere on this word map. And if I think about culture in the broadest sense, and if I look at this word map, and if I somehow just put in my own mind that little teeny word race, it would be so small on this map. And yet the impact of race is so powerful that if I were to put it on the top of this word map, even in its tiniest little form and word font, it would crush culture altogether. Peggy Mcintosh came to the St. Paul Foundation to teach when she won an award for facing race. She taught about the 5 myths that she said support white privilege. She asked people in the audience to begin to unpack our invisible knapsacks, to recognize that there is reality to race. A mentor of mine, Mahmoud El-Kati, who is the Chair Emeritus of American History at Macalester College, teaches us that the myth of race is different than the reality of racism. That the myths are the beliefs, and racism is the verb. It's the action. It's the doing. Racism, by the way, to be clear, requires prejudice plus power. If you do not have the opportunity to affect someone's life by racing them, then you perhaps lack the power that is required to make racism a verb. But those myths turn deadly. And when I think about the reactions we've had to the murder of George Floyd, many people who are white said to me, I am shocked. I cannot believe this. I never knew. And every Black person I knew was like, what? What? How? And then I remembered when Tim Wise was on the show and I cut that audio. We don't have the same experience because of these myths. Meritocracy. Peggy says, every individual is responsible for his or her own destiny, not influenced by society or circumstance. This, she says, allows the denial of any systems of oppression or privilege. You know, you do well here because you do well. Doesn't matter who you are or how much money you make or your race, you do great. But we know that women in this country make less than men for the same job, sometimes significantly less. And then when we look at the number of women-headed households, we see the number of children who are left impoverished because of our policy. Our belief that women's work, perhaps, I don't know, is not worth the same amount. I'm not sure if that's what it's saying, but I think so. And while I'm not trying to be political, I'm trying to get you to see how a myth turns into a reality that then costs intergenerational wealth for generations. These myths we need to hold so dear, that somehow I didn't have any advantages because I'm light-skinned, would be untrue. But do I get as many advantages if I were white? Not in my experience. Is it somebody's fault that privilege is afforded at birth? I don't think so, but I do think we can fix it. The myth of personal responsibility, get rid of it. Myth 2, the land. I keep meaning to add to this slide that song, This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land, from California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land is made for you and me. James Baldwin said, public education in this country, if you're white, is indoctrination. And if you're Black, subjugation. I'm a kindergartner because that's what kindergartners do. They sing what the teacher tells them to sing, and you pledge allegiance to the flag, and you do all the things that you're supposed to do. But I can't imagine Jeff, who was in 2nd grade, sitting next to me, being Indigenous, listening to us sing out our little hearts about this land is your land. What his parents must have said when he came home. But I didn't know. But I can still sing the song. But my grandmother said I couldn't carry a tune if it were in a bag, so I'll spare you that. Peggy says, manifest destiny. God gave white people the land that formed the United States. This allows denial, she says, that we all live on land taken from indigenous people who, she writes, whose culture and existence white people sought to destroy. Indian removal, Andrew Jackson. People are more than one thing, but they are also more than one thing. We are on land that isn't ours. And I don't know whether we're still teaching our kids. I have to ask my grandkids, this land is your land. But I think in the future, I'm going to add that to the slide just so I don't have to sing it. Because it's kind of painful to sing now that I know. White racelessness. Peggy writes, white people are normal and set the standard for what it means to be human. Non-whites have race, which she says causes problems for them and for us. The author Toni Morrison was told that she'd never win a prize for her writing because she centered on Black life and the people around her in her community. She didn't center white people in her stories. She later won a Pulitzer Prize. But she said, American means you're white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. Asian American, African American. You dig? Myths that this country holds very dear. Myths that we are confronted with even today. Monoculture. There's only one American culture, and when people of color don't assimilate, they aren't behaving appropriately. Do you remember monoculture earlier in the presentation? Why doesn't everybody just act one way? Why can't we all follow the matrix? When human beings crave uniqueness and individuality and a chance to do. But if we don't do it like white people do, we are deviant. It just almost, I don't know. No matter how many times I talk about these, I really wrestle with these each time. And I wrestle with the fact that I grew up on these myths too. That I have to do a searching and fearless moral inventory every day to see who is in my head. White moral elevation. This one is particularly difficult. White people are in charge of the world and entrusted with power. This, Peggy says, justifies a sense of internalized superiority when encountering those of other races. My husband and I have taken to riding bikes shortly before the pandemic, maybe a summer or so ago. And in Minneapolis, they have this cool light where the bike streets have not only the traffic light, but they have this really cool bike light that has a little bike, and it has green and yellow and red and all that. And the bike light goes first before the cars for safety. And so it's really, really cool. Anyway, so we were practicing, my husband and I, and we were riding our bikes. And this cool bike light came on, and we crossed the street. And this man from nowhere yells, "You two, you don't cross the street on a red." And I'm like, we're both looking like, who's he talking? Is he talking to us? And he proceeds to use all kinds of colorful language that he must learn from somewhere about Black people. I don't know. It was horrible. I don't know if he speaks to his mother with that mouth, but it was terrible. At any rate, he read us the riot act, and I realized, sir, first of all, you're not in charge of us, A. And B, we went properly with the light, which, by the way, C, I do not owe you an explanation for, because D, I'm on my bike minding my own business with my own husband. Are you serious? But I recognized right there that the justified sense of internalized superiority was what caused him to do that, to speak to us like we were children. And it took a lot. It took a lot to be classy in that situation, because that myth triggers me too. And finally, I added one. Rudyard Kipling went to Africa and wrote a poem in which he called out and described the white man's burden. He wanted the United States to invade the Philippines and take over the Filipinos and get them to assimilate. And so he made up the idea that the white man is entrusted with power and has to fix everyone else in the world. This one is particularly hard when you sit in the present day and look at our grave difficulties and how long whiteness as an idea, a construct, has had currency and power over us. 4 centuries. 4. Now, you don't have to make it political, but just look around at the state of the world and ask yourself whether these myths have served us. And if they do not serve us, can we let them go? For the cause of peace and equity, can we do a searching and fearless moral inventory? Every decision, every thought. Who is in my head? This land is not my land. And I didn't steal it. But it doesn't keep me from acknowledging that I am on stolen land. And whatever I can do individually about it, I would try to do, though I'm not certain what it would be. No one is asking anyone to be responsible for what happened yesteryear, just for what happens from here. Dr. Jonathan Lofgren is my husband, and I don't often quote him in my presentations just because I think it's, I don't know, kind of weird. Except this one he says just gets me every time. Race is assigned, but culture is chosen. I could choose to describe myself in many, many ways. I could choose many ways and not use the word Black. But immediately when I'm born, someone made me Black. I often find it sad, fascinating, frustrating when people come to this country who have Black skin. A woman on the radio last night, in talking about being defined as Black, said, "I think you people are absolutely crazy. I am from Cameroon. There are no Black people in Africa. Everybody's Black. We don't have Black people. We have Cameroon, we have Nigerian, we have Liberian, we have Eritrean. I mean, where did you guys get this Black thing? We hold it so closely so as to drown out culture. And we decide the value of a human life, or the value of or the kind of diagnosis, or the value of help, or how much help someone's going to get based on what they are assigned. I'd like to ask you to take a moment to reflect. First, maybe we'll take a deep breath. This is hard stuff. If you're at home and you want to drink a glass of water, now notice your body. Growing up, where did you get your primary information about race? When do you remember somebody first talking to you about it? Did they use the word race? How did you first notice someone was not the same race? If you have a little notepad, maybe you want to just make a little note for yourself that you can come back to later. And maybe you'll share on this Zoom later in just a few minutes where you got your information. Where do you get it now? Where do you get your primary information about race now? At thewhitenessproject.org, there's a series of vignettes that outline, or I should say that have people talking about what they believe about being white. It's fascinating, sometimes hard. But one of the things they report at the end of each vignette, they give a little statistic of some type based on the research that the Whiteness Project did. 76% of white Americans report having only primary relationships with other white people. I'm a Scorpio, so I dislike groupthink. That sounds a lot like groupthink. Sounds like there might be some limitations for some people on the information they might have about other groups if we don't have relationships with them. Dr. King thought that that was really the goal of segregation, to keep people raced, to keep them from being seen as human, to keep people from seeing that I take my garbage out on Thursday morning the same way my neighbor does. And I want my kids to do well. And I want my family to avoid the COVID virus. And I'm hopeful that everyone's going to get a vaccine if they want to take it. And I wish the world would be nicer to each other. Has nothing to do with my race. Somebody gave that to me. I wish I could give it back. Not because I don't love being Black, because I do. But my Blackness has to do with culture. Somebody else saddled me with race. How many personal, cross-cultural, or racial relationships do you have today? And I'm not talking about the person at work who sits in the cube and you see them at coffee when you went to work. Reflect on an experience you've had with race. And how did it make you feel? In our culture, busy is the way that we mark a person of achievement. Oh, they're so busy, they must be fabulous. We have no idea whether they're sitting at home all day or not, but we have this perception that they're so busy. And those perceptions can be held forever if we have limited experience with that person, and the only time we see them is when they're so busy. But if we actually have a relationship with someone, sometimes we might see that that person has a lot of time for tea and coffee, that maybe the appearance of busy is for a purpose. And maybe because we didn't have enough information, we didn't get a chance to see the whole being. And that's sort of what race does. It shrouds human beings. It allows us to do terrible things to each other in the name of race, something we made up. So I'm certain we can make up something else. James Baldwin is one of my favorite people in the universe, though he's not alive any longer. And he's certainly one of my most favorite writers on race. If you want to really get hip to race, read anything by James Baldwin. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. We can say that it didn't matter what our ancestors did, and I'm not responsible, but what they felt is in me, and what they felt is in you. And the question is whether or not we can do what a good therapist would help us do. Dig very deeply when we hit a rock, recognizing all these beliefs we've held dear and all the help and all the stigma we might have thrown upon someone for their diagnosis or because they're raced with a diagnosis. That history is trapped, but it doesn't have to be. We can get new information. And if you're like me, I can only hold so much up here. So if I get new information in that's good, it might put the bad information out. My grandmother was not a bad person, but she had a different experience. And she gave me a language for her experience. That was what she had. And me making her a bad person wouldn't change her experience or my love for her. But I must recognize that her language was reflective of her experience. And still, in many ways, is reflective of mine.
Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything. The fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in songs by former slaves, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time.
God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. Fire next time. What James Baldwin is talking about, what Maya was reading about, is about the idea that we prepared for a flood because we had one before. But if we don't deal with it, the relatively conscious few, we are going to have a fire. And I would argue in this time and context, there are little fires everywhere. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Lissa. We've got some questions in the chat box here. So I'm in the Q&A box. And if anyone has any additional questions, please enter them there. So the first question for you, this person is looking for and my dog has some comments as well. Tips for delivering service in a fair and unbiased manner to individuals, not groups, but individual persons.
Excellent. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has a number of practices they produce. They call them tips. I think it's SAMHSA tip 59 is the tip for culturally informed services. There are tips for women, there are tips for men, there are tips for children. I encourage you to check out the tips at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Those practices can be administered to individuals or groups and are informed by the way people identify themselves, the way they group themselves, so that the services we provide are informed to be equitable and competent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So another question for you, as someone who is not part of the Black community, what is the best way for us to be advocates without coming across as unintentionally ignorant or disrespectful? I feel the need to be involved, but I don't know where to start.
That's a very thoughtful question. Thank you. Each of these has been very thoughtful. I don't say that to the detriment of the first question. There's a saying, pull the log out of your own eye before you worry about your neighbor. And what I guess I'm saying is that for me, this idea of me doing a searching and fearless moral inventory on my own ideas about whiteness and non-whiteness is huge work to do every single day. That is not to say that I don't have other work I have to do, but it really starts with me being honest about what my beliefs and values are, getting past my labels of liberalism or Minnesotan or whatever the thousands of ways I want to classify myself to be a beautiful, wonderful, non-blemished person. I think that personal work is the work that really, if you center on that, what you're going to notice is everybody around you is influenced differently. That's really what happened in this country with the civil rights movement. People changed because other people changed. So somebody changed the game and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And other people said, you know what, I agree. I don't think we should do this anymore. And groups of people got together. And then all of a sudden the country said, well, wait, maybe there's a different way we should be doing this thing. And you can argue, you know, the value and how far we've come or whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, if you change, everything around you tends to change. So I always suggest working with self and then just telling people, frankly, I'm working hard to be the best person that I can be. And if I flub up, I will ask for grace and I'll try again.
All right, the next one is, the comment is, I would like to hear your thoughts on the Early Childhood Iowa Equity Guiding Principles. And it is a commitment to address equity. And their definition of equity means responding so people have what they need to be successful. So by moving from quality to equity, we recognize the relevance of race and ethnicity. We value individuals' potential and strengths and develop supports and services that are responsive to each and every child and family. We are committed to building systems where disparities based on race and ethnicity no longer exist. What are your thoughts? Is there anything that you could share?
Well, I would tell you that I'm not familiar with those. They sound wonderful, and so I will not weigh in on those because I do not know, but they sound wonderful. The principles certainly I concur and agree with. You know, the problem with oppression is if this is the oppressed person and I'm on top, what's the problem? Both of us are stuck, right? That's what we really never have figured out. Both of us are stuck, like nobody can move. And so I think those principles are excellent. The question is how we actually make those a verb. And part of that is each practitioner doing the searching and fearless moral inventory, each practitioner being willing, like we would with a therapist, to go into those private places and ask ourselves, where did I get that information? And is there additional information I need to have to assure that the children I'm serving get the absolute best that I intend for them? Thank you.
My apologies to everyone. My dog is really loud at this time of day because this is when the mailman comes. So my apologies. I'm going to talk loud and hope that you can hear what I'm having to say here. So the next, the next question is a specific one, and the person says, I teach at a community college. My employer uses the term Thanksgiving break. Celebrating Thanksgiving is harmful to Indigenous people. My employer will not acknowledge this viewpoint. How do you suggest I advocate for change?
First of all, I'd like to say I'm sorry. I think that we don't allow people to sit with the wounds that we give them. And when we don't do our searching and fearless moral inventory, we end up wounding people all over the place, intentionally or otherwise. I'm a fan of creating a small group, which I call a creative minority, of people who can see the world as you do. And begin to see if you can have conversations in that institution about why that is harmful and not helpful. And see whether that creative minority can create the kind of conversations that will ultimately lead to a cultural majority of people saying, this we are not comfortable with, and we would like you to use holiday break or whatever word you would like to use. Sometimes leadership can be tone deaf. I'll just be honest. When I'm sitting in an interim executive directorships, oftentimes I think, oh, this is a wonderful place to work. And really, you look around and the people are like, I do not think so. And so I find myself always going back downstairs and saying, I want my desk to be downstairs by everybody else, because I want to know what's really going on so I can really help. And so I'm sorry for that experience. I applaud you for continuing forward, and I hear you, and I'm with you.
So we have another one that goes hand in hand with this. So I'm going to keep you kind of on a similar topic, just branching a little bit. So do you have any tips for workplaces that are interested in moving past diversity goals and moving towards inclusion? And to add to that, for leadership that is really just talking the talk, how do you push people to walk the walk?
Well, that's a series of good questions. I think if people are serious, I'll give you this example. When I'm coaching executives, they first bring me into their company and they say, you know, this is our mission, and this is what I'm doing, and we're fabulous, and our company's so good at everything. And I'm like, oh, wonderful, wonderful. Or in my grandmother's words, wunderbar. That's great. Well, then I say, all right, can you hand me your calendar and your budget? And this is what they'd look, huh? And I say, oh, I was just going to see if you can just mind me handing me your calendar and your budget. Because why? Where you spend your time is what's important to you. And the other is where you spend your money. So if companies want to be serious, number one, I suggest they get an equity and culture coach. Because much like therapy, when these initiatives become hard, or when they might be more expensive than people wanted to invest in, you need somebody to say, hey, you said you wanted to go the distance, let's go. So I often suggest a culture coach. How do you make people do it? You can't make people do anything, really. I mean, everybody's in charge of themselves. We have this myth about we're in charge. We're not. People do what they want to do. I think what you can do is you can model different behavior, use different language, get your creative minority together. You can start doing differently. And eventually people will either resonate to the culture change or they won't. Sometimes you have to leave a culture in order for it to change. Sometimes you can change it from the inside. But it often feels, when you're doing culture change work, like Sisyphus. You push the rock to the top of the hill, and as soon as you think you arrive, the daggone thing comes right back down. So it's a process.
Thank you. Love that. Here's a good one. If we feel we have not treated someone in a sensitive way, is it appropriate to apologize to the person for not being culturally sensitive?
I think, first of all, it's a great question. I think there's always room to apologize. In a world that's kind of cruel, a kindergarten rule, like I'm sorry, that really goes a long way. It may not erase the wound, but I think it would certainly help to mitigate it. What I might recommend is, if you have a safe and trusted person that you can practice with, it might be a good idea to practice a couple times. And the reason I say that is sometimes when I say I'm sorry, it centers on me. I'm sorry I wounded you. I had a bad day. My kids were acting up. My dog was going crazy. My dad was mad. My husband didn't cook, whatever it is. I'm really sorry. And that's kind of like, right, kind of sorry that you said it, but are you sorry that I'm hurt? So you might want to practice and just, I think when you say I'm sorry, people will respect that. I think there's always room to say you're sorry.
So here's a question about mental health counseling and mental health treatment and the issue that they see of people of color or certain cultures not believing in or being accepting or willing to seek out those services. Could you talk to us a little bit about this and anything that you'd like to share on that topic?
That's a very good question. Thank you so much. Get more information. That's what I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to answer. I'm going to say, get more information. So for example, as an African-American woman, if you write down Henrietta Lacks, Lacks, Henrietta was diagnosed with cancer. And unbeknownst to her, because she was poor, she wasn't saved, she was poor and Black, she died. Unbeknownst to her, her DNA was taken. And Henrietta's cells have actually cured all kinds of diseases. Her family's never been compensated. No one would ever have known Henrietta Lack's name, probably if Oprah hadn't done a piece on her, and there have been books now on Henrietta. But you will be shocked to find out how many diseases this one Black woman, her cells were the first to ever be able to regenerate, and they were able to send them all over the world. She's a Black woman. No one ever says Henrietta Lacks, but she's still curing diseases today. Now, why would Black people be reticent to deal with medical people? That's just one example for one community. So I ask you to do your homework and ask why people might be afraid of institutions, why they might be suspicious of institutions, having been raced. Last thing I will say, there's a very famous author, Claudia Rankin. I just interviewed her for a podcast. She went to the doctor. She's a Black woman. She went to the doctor and thought that she had something going on with her breasts. And the doctor said, no, go back home. You're fine. You don't have anything. So she went back home for 3 months. She decided to call an African-American woman she knew who was a doctor, who specialized in women. And she went to her and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. The first doctor told her, I guess I didn't really take it seriously. Because in their secret heart, Black women, that Black woman, didn't deserve to be treated or didn't deserve further inquiry. And she could have died. Save the fact, just forget the fact she's famous. I just say that so you can look her up. How sad. And what happens in a pandemic to people who are already in the middle of multiple pandemics when you have to select who gets to live and who doesn't? My grandmother or yours? How sad.
So another question for you here on a different topic. The person says, white people regularly push the savior stuff on my name and my face. Did you keep any of your ancestral culture? And what do you do to stay connected to your cultural identity?
Will you please read that one more time? That was complex.
Sure. They comment, white people regularly push the savior stuff on my name and my face. Did you keep any of your ancestral culture? And what do you do to stay connected to your cultural identity?
Okay, well, first of all, we are all taught the myth of the white savior at some point. I don't know when we were taught that. I don't know. Is it by osmosis? I don't know. So yes, that is something that happens all the time. I mean, I will have to go save everyone because I'm white. That is just ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous. And plus, who could do it? So it's a myth that I see all the time. I agree. It's a myth many people use. Sometimes not people who aren't white because we're taught those things. I stay grounded with Black people, quite frankly. I stay grounded in Black tradition. I have Black study groups. I have Black girlfriends. I mean, I have girlfriends of all kinds of hues, but I center myself with Black people and Black experiences. I host a podcast for protecting the Black literary canon, protecting Black authors, amplifying and talking about their own work. I host a radio show on Minnesota's oldest and really only Black radio station, KMOJ, about the Black experience and informing and giving us new information and new ways to see ourselves as beautiful Black people. So those are some ways. Very good question, very complex.
How does one fight monoculturalism in the legal process? Any thoughts on that?
Brown versus the Board of Education, most people don't know, was a lawsuit that was brought across the country. It wasn't just one lawsuit. And the reason I bring that up is because we still don't have education equity today, even though the Supreme Court said integrate with all deliberate speed. What they meant was go as slowly as possible, and we really have. It's a part of segregating. So I don't know. We bring class action lawsuits all the time about unrighteous behavior. And it's very difficult to know how to legislate it in the courts. It's going to be difficult to know going forward in the kind of environment that we're in, what's going to happen to the rights that were largely afforded to Black people in the courts. What happens? I don't know. I wish I did.
The last topic that I see here, and you have touched on it, so this will really just be if there's anything additional that you'd like to share on it. One person comments that they work at a nursing school, and another comments about physicians, and how can we be better? How can we teach the next generations of healthcare professionals so that we have a better commitment to ensuring equity in the healthcare arena?
Start with self, stay with self, work on self. I can't say that enough. We are all, part of the white savior myth is looking for a checklist back to right. And there isn't a checklist. We know what not to do. We know how not to treat people. And I guess what I would say is if you as the practitioner are doing the best you can to be the best you can be in competency and equity and goodness and humanity and equality, everybody around you will be affected by that. And so the big lift is right here. It's the searching and fearless moral inventory, every decision, every day. What did my grandmother say about that might have triggered me to give him less than what he deserved? What is it in my spirit that I can feel my body tense up when they say this descriptor of somebody, and I realize that I'm not going to quite give them adequate service? That's the kind of stuff that takes all day long, every day, to root out, to figure out, because if the root of something is bad, the flower can blossom, but it's not going to live. And so the best thing we can do is practice here, get more information, tell people about it. When things come up in your private circles and those little conversations people would never want to have on Zoom, say, you know what? I've sat with a lot of Black people. That isn't my experience.
Lissa, I want to thank you for today. I also want to encourage you to take a look at the chat box. There's a lot of really, really nice thoughts and praise and just people wanting to communicate with you. So I want to make sure you take a minute to look at that. And maybe our producers can send that to you too. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but and then I'm going to pass it over to Peggy, who's going to close out the session and let everybody know what's happening next.
I'm very, very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lissa. A very powerful. I knew you'd be great, and I'm so glad we were able to have you as part of our day today. You've added so much to the day, and I know that you've made people think. I hope that they will take your words to heart and will work on themselves and their own circles, their work environment, their families and friends. Because if we all take on that work seriously, we can make the world better, at least in our areas, in our circles, right? We didn't have enough time to cover everything, but I think we made a good dent in it. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate it. So it is now noon. We are now closing out this session. We are going to have a lunch break of 30 minutes. And then at 12:30, we are going to return with 3 breakout sessions. And in the afternoon, we're going to actually have 2 sessions of that, from 12:30 to 1:30, and then from 1:45 to 2:45. We're going to have 3 different breakout sessions going on at once, and the links to that are on the event site. Then at 3 o'clock, we're all going to come back together to hear from Ernie and Joe. Ernie and Joe, Crisis Cops. We're going to see a 25-minute version of the documentary, and we're going to hear from them as well as the film's director and producer, Jennifer McShane. So it's going to be a terrific session. Don't want any of you to miss it. But in the meantime, we have some fantastic breakout sessions. So grab a quick lunch, get a stretch, and we'll see you back here in our breakout session at 12:30. Thank you.